Greetings, scholars. Coming to you from the high school library, here's your APUSH review for Unit 16 on JFK, LBJ, Nixon, and the Vietnam War. The first thing you need to know, and I'm looking at the review sheet here, first thing you need to be aware of is the sort of the ending here of the civil rights movement, which we talked about in the last unit in the 1950s, which really begins with this double V idea of victory over the Nazis and the fascists and the Japanese now should lead to victory over racism in the United States. And we talked in the 50s about Emmett Till and about the bus boycott in Montgomery and the Brown decision and the situation in 1957 in Little Rock. And the notes in the last unit, I kept it all together thematically, but some of the things that we went over last unit do take place in the 60s. And the culmination here is going to be the 1964 Civil Rights Act that Johnson signs, which ends segregation in public places. In 1965, the Voting Rights Act sends federal registrars into the South where blacks are disproportionately registered to vote to make sure that they're signed up in voting. So these two things, the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act of 64 and 65, are sort of the bookend to this long struggle for equality by African Americans. The I Have a Dream speech is this famous address that Martin Luther King gives on the Mall in Washington, D.C. in 1963 with several hundred thousand civil rights protesters. They're asking that segregation end in the South. And the Freedom Riders, these are those people, 1961, they're moving into the South, testing the Supreme Court's decision that there must be no segregation in interstate travel. The Freedom Summer refers to the working to register disenfranchised black voters in Mississippi. And these are some of the events here in the 1960s. Actually, also in 1960, the sit-ins at the Woolworths counters began in Greensboro. And that's going to bring about 70,000 people into sit-in protests. So these things are happening on the other side of the 50s and the 60s. The civil rights victories of the 60s in comparison to the New Deal and progressivism are unique in that during the New Deal and progressivism, there's little to no concern about civil rights at all. And the civil rights movement does influence other movements. Women's rights are in the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And you should be familiar again with Betty Friedan. Her book in 1963 is talking about her experiences and experiences of many stay-at-home women, stay-at-home moms in the 1950s. But you should be familiar again with Betty Friedan and the feminine mystique, and also be familiar with Gloria Steinem, who's one of the founders of the National Organization of Women. There's also a movement for Hispanic rights, the Chicano movement, which is Mexican Americans or Brown Power. There's concern for Native American rights and taking these broken treaties to the courts and getting some restitution, the American Indian movement. And there's, the book wants you to know, the beginning of the gay rights movement. There's the Stonewall riot in 1969 in Greenwich Village in New York, where the cops are harassing and beating up gays, and the gays fight back. The opponents to civil rights for the longest time have been the Southern congressmen from the Deep South, and one of the great achievements of Lyndon Baines Johnson is he uses his clout, he uses his legislative skill as a former Senate Majority Leader, and as a Texan, that's really quite amazing. He is going to successfully push through this long-stalled legislation, which really is being pushed by the Democrats as early as the 1940s under Truman. Remember, the Dixiecrats break off in his when he runs on his own in 1948. The New Frontier is the program of John Kennedy to eradicate poverty and the push for civil rights, and that's largely achieved in its fullness in the Great Society, which is picked up by Lyndon Baines Johnson when he becomes president after Kennedy's assassination. And the Great Society, you should be familiar with ways in which it's similar and ways in which it's different from the New Deal. Some ways in which it's similar, there's concern for the elderly. In the New Deal, you have Social Security. Great Society, you have Medicare. Both programs are dealing with the issue of poverty, but in a different context. The New Deal, remember the 3 R's. We have an economic catastrophe. We have huge joblessness and unemployment, and the goal here is to have recovery, to have reform, and to have immediate relief for the many who are unemployed or underemployed, whereas the Great Society is looking for that persistent bottom tier, that bottom fifth that Michael Harrington talks about in The Other American, to bring these people out of poverty through government welfare programs. The differences are huge. The Great Society is going to push for and achieve civil rights. The Great Society is going to have all these environmental programs. There's going to be the Clean Air Act and the Water Act, and there's going to be waste management and river restoration acts, these things to clean the environment. There's going to be educational programs, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, for example, and the Head Start program for preschoolers. The foreign policy under Kennedy, one of the contrasts is after the Bay of Pigs and as we began to send advisors into Vietnam, there's concern that we have depended for too long upon this concept of massive retaliation, which is put forward by John Foster Dulles under Eisenhower, Dulles being the Secretary of State. And remember, massive retaliation is we don't need a lot of conventional weapons because we've got this huge stockpile of nukes and we'll take the Russians out if they try anything. But there's this growing recognition that we're going to be involved in perhaps hot wars, shooting wars, where we can't use nukes. And this idea that Kennedy's going to put forward is called flexible response. It's a term on your review sheet here. And flexible response is the rebuilding up perfect conventional forces and to use special forces like the Green Beret in places like Vietnam to use limited military efforts for limited, more local goals here. The international confrontations under Kennedy, the first one he has, which is really planned under Eisenhower and executed very poorly, it becomes a fiasco under Kennedy, is the Bay of Pigs invasion. Castro's tipped off, and out of the 2,000 invaders, about 500 of them are killed and about 1,500 of them are captured. And the weakness here is going to lead Khrushchev to think that we're soft, and he builds the wall in Berlin in 1961. And keep in mind here, the Berlin blockade and airlift, that's under Truman, and that's back in the 40s. The wall isn't built until 1961. And since we have no response to building that wall, in 1962, Khrushchev is going to feel confident that he can put nuclear missiles under our noses in Cuba, and that's going to lead to Kennedy standing up for the United States, putting a quarantine or a blockade around Cuba, and Khrushchev will be forced to pull those missiles out, although we'll help him save face. At least we'll attempt to by pulling our missiles out of Turkey and agreeing not to invade Cuba. Khrushchev will be deposed by the Presidium, by the ruling communist leaders, and we're going to have Leonid Brezhnev in the following years. Kennedy will vow while he's in office to put a man on the moon, and we will do that. The Apollo 11 mission will land under Richard Nixon in 1969. The influence of TV on the civil rights movement is it puts this in people's living rooms. It puts the beatings and the cattle prods and the German Shepherd attacks and the fire hoses. This is all, the ugliness of racism is being made public, and this is one thing that's going to win huge sympathy, even in the South, for the nonviolent civil disobedience of those who are following Martin Luther King and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee in the Congress on Racial Equality. And TV is also very influential in other ways. The election of 1960, some people feel that this very, very close election where Kennedy won by only 100,000 votes out of 68 million votes cast had something to do with how Kennedy was more telegenic and came across better on TV. Also, TV will bring Vietnam again into people's dining rooms while they're eating dinner. They're watching the news and they're watching American soldiers in body bags being thrown onto helicopters, and they're watching this long, drawn-out war. And it's also going to have, TV is also going to have an influence on the Nixon administration. These hearings by the Senate Investigating Committee are going to expose the skullduggery that happened in Nixon. In the Nixon years in the Oval Office. As far as the Vietnam War goes, the escalation will take place under Johnson. We're going to go from about 15,000, 16,000 advisors under Kennedy to over 500,000 boots on the ground under Johnson, and this is going to kill his presidency. He will choose not to run in 1968. Some criticisms of the war. Why would anybody criticize this war? It's a continuation of this policy of containment of communism, which we had since the end of World War II. Well, Some of the arguments are that this is a civil war and it wasn't our business. Other people argue that this was an act of American imperialism. Other people argued that this war was being fought with an utter disregard for Vietnamese life, and the Vietnamese were dying by the tens and the hundreds of thousands in this war. That's civilians. That we, throughout the war, were essentially supporting non-democratic South Vietnamese governments, and you saw that coup of Ngo Dinh Diem under Kennedy and his assassination by the Vietnamese military, basically with our complicity, and at least as far as the overthrow goes. There were those who argued the war was being incompetently fought, and after the Tet Offensive in '68, there were many who felt that the war just could not be won, and certainly there's the loss of American life, and also the many, many young men who did not want to fight in this very questionable quagmire of a war. The criticism of Vietnam is perhaps most similar to the criticism of the Mexican-American War. Northerners voted against the Mexican-American War. They saw this as a Southern act of aggression. And keep in mind here some similarities here in how the war starts. The Mexican-American War sees American soldiers move into disputed territory, into what really arguably is Mexican land between the Nueces and the Rio Grande River. And you have this killing of American soldiers by